Hey everyone, TJ here, behalf of Mako Sports, and today I'll be doing a review on the Sony FS5 and if it is or is not worth it in 2020. Okay, so first let's get a little bit of housekeeping out of the way. I have a video on YouTube already which goes over the actual rig I use with this specific camera for shooting sporting events, that is, so completely rigged up and ready to roll. So if you're interested in seeing how I rig this specific camera, I definitely check out that video. I'll have it linked in the top right corner of the screen. Furthermore, if you are a videographer or photographer, I'd highly recommend that you check out my photography and videography Discord server. It's got over 5,000 members, tons of different people you can talk to and learn about different things as regards to photography and videography. So I highly recommend you check that out. I have that linked in the video description below. So let's go ahead and get into the review of the camera. Okay, so starting with the first pro of the camera, I'm going to be covering the body. So of course the body is a little bit bigger than your standard mirrorless or DSLR style camera. You've got a whole bunch of buttons on the side plate of the camera that have different features and functions, and some of them you can reprogram to do different things. So whereas with a mirrorless camera, you're probably going to be diving in the menus a whole bunch. With this one, everything for the most part is going to be on the outside of the camera that you need to access quickly, which is really nice. All right, so coming over to the other side of the camera, we have what I believe Sony calls is the Smart Grip. It is essentially just the grip for the camera. It's a lot more comfortable than your typical photography style body camera grip because it's more of a pistol style grip. So it's very comfortable in your hands. Nice thing about this specific grip is that it has a button that you can use to adjust the rotation of the handle. So if you're shooting high angles or low angles, you can simply just press the button and readjust the grip and it locks in place, which is really nice. Makes shooting a lot more comfortable. Also in that same grip, it has several buttons on it. It has different custom buttons that you can use that you can reprogram to do different functions. It has a zoom rocker, so if you're using a servo style lens like the 18-105, which is the kit lens for this specific camera, you can use the zoom rocker on the handle to zoom. It also has a joystick for jogging through the menu system. And like I said before, it has those same function buttons that you can choose to be different things. In true Sony XD cam camcorder fashion, it's very reliable and it's designed to be really a working's-man camera, come in and day out, get the job done with no major issues. I've never had this camera overheat on me, and I've shot in very hot conditions throughout the summertime. Summer ball games can be very hot and humid as well. The camera does have a fan in it, which really isn't audible, so that also helps to prevent the camera from getting too hot and overheating and shutting down on you. Coming over to the batteries, this camera, unlike most Sony cameras, actually has really good power draw. So depending upon the batteries you use, if you use BPU 60s or BPU 90s, these are the bigger batteries for this camera, you should be able to shoot for a very long amount of time, which is always nice to have when you're shooting video. All right, so let's move over to everyone's favorite topic, which is I/O. Just kidding, I/O is very important. But starting off with what this camera offers, on the back side of the camera, we have a 3G SDI input, which supports a 12-bit raw signal, which is fantastic. We have HDMI Type A, as well as an Ethernet port if you're doing any sort of live streaming or anything like that. On the audio side of things, we have two XLR inputs, one being on the rear portion of the body and one being on the top panel. So if you remove the top panel for like gimbal work or something like that, or you're flying it on a drone, you still have one XLR to get some way to get audio into the camera, which is nice to have. And of course, being a video camera, we do have a headphone jack to be able to monitor your audio when you're shooting. So my next pro for the FS5 would probably be its headline feature, which is the variable ND filter. This is very useful. It's nice to be able to just slap all your lenses or throw all your lenses into your camera bag and just go, not having to worry about separate rings or filters that you need to screw onto the front of your lens. It's very efficient. You just turn the dial on the side of the camera and you have your ND. And of course, with it being variable, you can choose whatever intensity you want from 1/4 all the way up to 1/128, which is fantastic. That's an enormous range for ND. If you want to work in the traditional fashion, you can use presets. You have 3 different presets you can choose. You can also reprogram these. But as it comes out of the factory, or stock that is, it starts off with ND or 2 stops of ND, 4 stops of ND, and then the 6 stops of ND. But of course, like I mentioned before, you can reprogram those to be different things, that is. Or you can just use the variable ND filter, which is what I recommend to use. The nice thing about this variable ND filter is that it's very high quality, so you don't have to deal with any sort of color shifts or anything along those lines that you usually have to deal with when you're using a screw-on style filter. So the glass inside of that filter is very high quality, which is awesome. So my next topic, depending upon what you're shooting, this might be a pro or a con, but internal the camera does do 10-bit, at least in 1080p or HD that is. It'll do 10-bit 422 all the way up to 240 frames per second, which is really awesome. So of course, you got your 24, 30, 60, 120, and 240 all up in 10-bit 422, which is really nice. That 10-bit image, gives you a lot of room to play with, to adjust colors and that sort of thing. It's really great for when you need to do noise reduction or anything along those lines, that is, or if you're shooting log video like SLOG2 or SLOG3, it also helps having that extra bit of color depth, that is, when you're doing your color grading. So this camera does slow motion a little bit different than most cameras, that is. This one is more along the lines of like a phantom camera, in that it uses cache recording. So you essentially wait for something to happen and then you press the record button and it'll write all the information to the card for an allotted amount of time. That's for both 120 frames per second as well as 240 frames per second. This can be both a pro and a con depending upon what you're doing. Of course, with continuous, you can get everything, but on the opposite end of continuous, you end up accumulating a lot of data and it takes forever to sort through all that footage. How with cache recording, it's nice because you can shoot everything you want in slow motion, and when you go home to edit the footage at the end of the day, you really only have the highlights or the things that you specifically wanted in slow motion. So you ended up having less footage to cull through, which can really speed up the process, that is, when you're editing. So one interesting feature you might find useful, depending upon the lens that you're using, the camera has a mode which is called center scan. And what it does is it takes a crop of the sensor. Because it's a 4K sensor, if you're shooting in 1080p, you can crop down that sensor to a certain width, that is, and that brings it to a super 60mm film size, which is nice because you can use super 60mm cinema lenses or even B4 lenses with the correct adapter. And with that, it essentially just opens you up to more lens options. So one cool thing about the FS5 is that it has the ability to output a RAW signal through the SDI port. So in order to do this RAW output, you will need to purchase the DLC or downloadable content for this camera, which is the RAW upgrade. I believe it's $400 or $500, so definitely not the cheapest thing, but it can definitely breathe a little bit of life into the camera. That will allow you to do, I believe, ProRes RAW or just standard DNx HD style RAW with an external recorder, that is. And with that exact upgrade, you can do all the way up to 4K 120 frames per second in 4K RAW at a 4-second burst, which even then 4 seconds doesn't seem like a long time, but once you stretch it out over 120 frames per second, that is a decent amount of record time. So it's a really nice, cool feature that you have the ability to take advantage of. And of course, alongside of that, you have the standard 24, 30, 60 frames per second that you can do whatever with, that is pushing your color grades a little bit further, all sorts of things. Just to know that you have that ability to do RAW is really nice with this camera. So my next pro for this camera is a big one, and that is the fact that it uses the Sony E-mount system, or the actual E-mount for the lens mount for the camera. So that's the same as like a Sony A7 body or a Sony A6000 body. So already you have a ton of different native options that you can choose from the lenses, but also what you can do is adapt different lenses. So anything from vintage lenses, if you want to use, cinema lenses with a PL mount adapter, you can do that as well as you can use a speed booster. So if you want to get more of that full frame look, you can absolutely do that with this camera. And with that speed booster, you can use like EF lenses, which are cheap and readily available. You can also do the same thing with like Nikon lenses. Really, the only thing you can adapt to this camera are other modern mirrorless mounts like Nikon Z mount or Canon RF. So for the most part, you have a ton of options to choose from as it pertains to lenses, which is fantastic. So my last bit I'm going to cover is the actual image quality of the camera. For the most part, it is pretty good. The dynamic range being at 14 stops is really solid, as well as the highlight roll-off for the most part is nice and smooth as well. So furthermore, with image quality, being a Sony camera, you've got the full slew of picture profiles. So you have SLOG 2 and 3 for very high dynamic range kind of shoots. You've got the HLG profiles if you want to go that route. You also have the Cine gamma, so Cine 1, 2, 3, and 4. And lastly, you have the center kind of Rec 709 or Rec 709 like picture profiles for, quick turnaround time type project. So of course, with all those picture profiles, the FS5 is very versatile. You have the ability to shoot quick turnaround time Rec 709 stuff, or you can do where you're spending a whole bunch of time in post and you're kind of tweaking the look you want to get with those log profiles. So you have a lot to choose from when you're shooting with the FS5. Okay, so we talked about the good stuff with the camera. Now it's time to talk about the not so good stuff with the Sony FS5. The first one I'm going to cover is going to be the low light performance of this camera. So if you're exposing the camera with ISO, which I not recommend you do, I really recommend you use DV, but if you want to use ISO for some reason, I believe right around 3200 ISO is kind of where the camera starts to fall apart. And that's where you end up having a lot of issues with noise. And of course, anywhere above that, it just gets continuously worse and worse. And if you're using gain instead, around 15 is where it kind of stops looking good. Anything above that is going to look continuously worse and worse. Next thing I'm going to talk about is the 4K detail on the camera. Something I've seen a lot of FS5 users talk about as well is the 4K isn't very sharp. It's kind of similar to a Canon 4K that is, so it doesn't have a whole bunch of detail. So if you're coming from like a Sony, A7iii or an A6600, something with that, 6K to 4K oversampled image, this is going to look very soft to you. Doesn't have a whole bunch of detail to it, especially compared to the 1080. The 1080 is very detailed. The 4K, however, for some reason isn't. So that's just one thing to take note of. The 4K isn't super, razor tack sharp like how it is on the alpha bodies. Next thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of a nitpick, but it only has one XLR on the body. I wish both of them were on the body, because if you're taking this camera off or the top handle off, you want to kind of strip down the rig a little bit. Even if you're not flying it on a gimbal, you're not flying it on a drone or a hexacopter, it still would be nice to have both XLRs on the body. So something similar to like how Panasonic has it on the EVA1, or even on like the C200 where it has the XLRs on the body. I really wish the FS5 had those both XLRs on the body, because it is kind of inconvenient depending upon the way you're rigging your system. With audio, that is, you might only be stuck with one XLR input, which is kind of unfortunate. Next up is going to be autofocus. Autofocus on this camera, it definitely uses more of a dated system. It's similar to the A7S II in that it's only contrast based autofocus, so it's not going to be very fast or very accurate, that is. So it definitely depends on the application that you want to use autofocus for. Certain things like very slow moving subjects with a lot of contrast will probably be okay. If you're doing like a talking head style interview and you're not shooting at a crazy fast aperture, kind of in between f4 and f5.6, you should be okay as long as the subject isn't rocking back and forth a whole bunch. Anything really past that, the autofocus isn't going to be very good. So any sort of fast action, sports, anything like how I do, the autofocus is basically unusable. So another thing to take note of, it's not going to be like an alpha body where it's very fast and accurate. So for the FS5, you're mostly going to be using manual focus. Next up is going to be the lack of internal 10-bit for 4K, that is. Now, of course, the HD is 10-bit. However, the 4K is only 8-bit 420. That is XAVCL, which is a long dot codec. That's another argument within itself, but it's only 8-bit 420 internal. So, it is what it is. I think they mainly did that to kind of keep it from hurting FS7 sales. However, I wish they would have updated it over time a little bit to give it that 10-bit. However, that's something you don't have. Of course, if you want to do 4K 10-bit, you can do that with the camera if you go out through the 3G SDI port on the back of the camera. So that's really the only way you can get a 10-bit 4K image out of this camera. Next up, we're going to talk about LUTs and LUT preview. With the FS5, if you're shooting an S-LOG2 or S-LOG3, of course, a way to really expose the camera is going to be at least one stop over. More likely, you're probably going to be going 1.5 to maybe 2 stops over. The camera does have a feature in the camera called Gamma Display Assist. However, if you're exposing correctly, which is 1 stop over for S-LOG or S-LOG2, that is, if you're exposing 1 stop over, 1.5 or 2 stops over, then your image on the LCD screen is going to look very blown out. So it's kind of a useless feature, because who exposes S-LOG3 quote unquote correctly, that is, like an even exposure. So if you want to preview LUTs, the camera first of all doesn't have any sort of LUT preview method. So it's not like the FS7 where you can, put in an SD card and have it display a LUT or something like that. In order to preview a LUT, you'll have to use an external monitor, which is something I'd recommend you get for the camera anyways. However, it doesn't have that feature or function internal, which is unfortunate as well. Lastly, this is also kind of a nitpick. However, if you want to do continuous 120 frames per second, you have to buy the camera DLC. So the FS5 has 2 different DLCs, or downloadable content. So the first one is the raw output or raw upgrade for the camera. I think that actually is worth the $500, because that essentially brings this camera up a whole tier. However, I think it's kind of ridiculous that Sony is charging you $500 just to be able to shoot continuous 120 frames per second, which is very silly. And for that mode, you don't even need the external recorder. So that's really something that they should have put into the camera upon release. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a couple of pro tips if you decide to actually go ahead out and get an FS5 for yourself. So for the first one, I would look into the function in the menu system called AE Shift. What you can do is it'll automatically expose the image to a certain level. So you can set it to be, 1.5 stops over. So if you're shooting S-LOG2 and you want it to always be 1.5 stops over, you can set it to program that so it'll always do that for you in camera. And you can use that in conjunction with the variable ND filter. So you can really just run around with this camera and just point it at stuff. It'll always keep your exposure correctly the way you want it to be for your log footage. If you're using like a Rec. 709 profile or a Cine Gamma, you want to underexpose just slightly, you can do that as well. So it'll let you do anything from negative 2 stops all the way to positive 2 stops, which is a really nice feature to have, and two things that you can use in tandem with each other for run and gun style shooting. One thing I recommend you pick up would be the SmallRig FS5 LCD mount. I think you can also use it for the Panasonic EVA1, but the stock LCD mount is plastic and is very flimsy. The SmallRig one is aluminum. I think it's only 30 bucks. It's absolutely worth it. It'll pay for itself in its first shoot. Rock solid, and actually the tube on it, just like the stock one, is a 15mm rod, so you can use like a monitor mount, and you can use that to hang your monitor off the side of the camera, which is fantastic as well. So you don't have to go out and buy, something else entirely to be able to rig up a monitor for your camera. Okay, so my final pro tip is going to be about batteries for the FS5. I recommend going with BPU 60 batteries. Those are like the medium-sized batteries, just like the one I have here in the camera, so you can see it's not too big. So compared to like the BPU 90s, which are the biggest batteries you can get, those ones I find to be just a little bit too big and too heavy for the camera. They also stick out pretty far on the back, so it kind of throws off the weight or the balance of the camera. The BPU 30s, now if you're flying on like a gimbal or a hexacopter or something like that, that's where you might want to use a BPU 30, but for standard shooting, those are only going to give you around 2 to maybe 2.5 hours of record time. The BPU 60 batteries, on the other hand, like I said, are kind of that sweet spot. These should give you around 3 to around 4 hours of shoot time, which is fantastic for, shooting video, of course. So now you might be wondering, who is the FS5 for? Well, that definitely depends if you're doing, any sort of corporate stuff or HD, or mostly HD stuff instead of 4K for the most part. This camera is still going to really shine in those areas. If you're doing sports or any sort of run and gun documentary, the ND filter in combination with that slow motion and that AE shift is really fantastic. You can really just kind of grab and go with this camera, almost as if it's like a standard, fixed lens camcorder. So you can really grab and go with this and then kind of hit the ground running, shoot really just about anything that is. So that's really about it for the FS5. I've enjoyed shooting on this camera so far. It's a fantastic platform to shoot on. It's very easy to use, like I mentioned before. That ND filter is a real killer, absolutely. The XLR inputs are fantastic. You can use those in combination with those great preamps that the FS5 has. That 12-bit signal that comes out of the SDI port, which is also really nice, something that you can take advantage of and essentially breathes life into the camera, brings it up a step, or up a notch, that is. So overall, I've really enjoyed this camera. That's it for my Sony FS5 review. If you guys enjoyed the video or found it helpful, be sure to give it a like, subscribe to the channel for more content, and as always, thank you for watching.